section number 23 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1, Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. Part 2, Chapter 1, Part 1a. The Conquerors of Central America. The letters and narratives of Columbus and his companions, especially those dwelling upon the large quantity of gold and pearls found in the recently discovered countries, had inflamed the imagination of eager traders and of numbers of gentlemen who loved adventure. On the 10th of April, 1495, the Spanish government had issued an order allowing anyone who might wish to do so to go and discover new countries. But this privilege was so much abused, and Columbus complained so bitterly of its trenching upon established rights, that the permission was withdrawn on the 2nd of June, 1497, and 4 years later it became necessary to repeat the prohibition with more severe penalties attached to its infringement. The effect of the royal decree was at once to produce a kind of general rush to the Indies, and this was favored by Bishop Fonseca of Badajoz, through whose hands passed all business connected with the Indies, and of whom Columbus had had so much reason to complain. The admiral had but just left Sanlúcar on his third voyage, when 4 expeditions of discovery were fitted out almost at the same moment, at the cost of some rich shipowners, foremost among whom we find Pinzon's and Americas Vespucius. The first of these expeditions, which left the port of Santa Maria on the 20th of May, 1499, consisted of 4 vessels, and was commanded by Alonso Ojeda. Juan de la Cosa sailed with him as pilot. Americas Vespucius was also on board, but without any very clearly defined duties, but he would seem to have been astronomer to the fleet. Before entering on a brief account of this voyage, we will glance for a few moments at the 3 men whom we have just named. The last of the 3 especially plays a most important part in the discovery of the New World, which received its name from him. Ojeda, born at Cuenca about 1465, and brought up in the household of the Duke Medina Celi, had gained his first experience in arms in the wars against the Moors. Columbus enrolled him amongst the adventurers whom he recruited for his second voyage, when Ojeda distinguished himself alike by his cool courage and his readiness in surmounting all difficulties. What caused his complete rupture with Columbus remains a mystery. It appears still more inexplicable when we think of the distinguished services that Ojeda had rendered, especially in 1495, at the Battle of La Vega, when the Caribbean Confederation was annihilated. All we know is that on Ojeda's return to Spain, he found shelter and protection with Bishop Fonseca. It is said even that the Indian ministers supplied him with the journal of the admiral's last voyage, and the map of the countries which Columbus had discovered. The first pilot employed by Ojeda was Juan de la Cosa, born probably in Santona, in the Biscayan country. He had often sailed along the coast of Africa before accompanying Columbus on his first voyage, while in the second expedition he filled the post of hydrographer, maestro de hacer cartas. As specimens of La Cosa's talent in drawing maps may be mentioned 2 very curious ones still extant, one showing all the territory that had been acquired in Africa in 1500, the other on vellum and enriched with color like the first, giving the discoveries made by Columbus and his successors. The second pilot was Bartholomew Roldan, who had likewise sailed with Columbus on his voyage to Paria. As to Americas Vespucius, his duties were not, as we have said, very clearly defined. He was there to aid in making discoveries, per aiutare a descoprire, says the Italian text of his letter to Soldarini, Born at Florence on the 9th of March, 1451, Amerigo Vespucci belonged to a family of distinction and wealth. He had made mathematics, natural philosophy, and astrology, as it was then called, his special duties. His knowledge of history and literature, judging from his letters, appears to have been somewhat vague and ill-digested. He left Florence in 1492 without any special aim in view, and went to Spain, where he occupied himself at first in commercial pursuits. We hear of him in Seville acting as factor in the powerful trading house of his fellow countryman Juanoto Berardi. As this house had advanced money to Columbus for his second voyage, it is not unlikely that Vespucius had become acquainted with the admiral at this period of his career. On Juanoto's death in 1495, Vespucius was placed by his heirs at the end of the financial department of the house. Whether he may have been tired of a situation that he thought below his powers, or been seized in his turn with the fever for making new discoveries, or whether he hoped to make his fortune rapidly in the new countries reputed to be so rich, whatever in short may have been the motive that actuated him, at least this we know, that he joined Ojeda's expedition in 1499, this fact being so stated in Ojeda's deposition in the lawsuit instituted by the Treasury with the heirs of Columbus. The flotilla, consisting of 4 vessels, set sail on the 20th of May from Santa Maria, taking a southwesterly course, and in 27 days the American continent was sighted at the place which was named Venezuela, because the houses being built upon piles reminded the beholders of Venice. Ojeda, after some ineffectual attempts to hold intercourse with the natives, with whom he had several skirmishes, next saw the island of Margarita. After sailing about 250 miles to the east of the river Orinoco, he reached the Gulf of Paria, and entered a bay called the Bay of Las Perlas, for the natives of that part being employed in the pearl fisheries. Guided by the maps of Columbus, Ojeda passed by the Dragon's Mouth, which separates Trinidad from the continent, and returned westward to Cape La Vela. Then, after touching at the Caribbee Islands, where he made a number of prisoners, whom he hoped to sell for slaves in Spain, he was obliged to cast anchor at Yaquimo in Hispaniola on the 5th of September, 1499. Columbus, knowing Ojeda's courage and his restless spirit only too well, feared that he would introduce a new element of discord into the colony. He therefore dispatched Francisco Roldan with 2 caravels to inquire into his motives in coming to the island, and if necessary to prevent his landing. The admiral's fears were but too well grounded. Ojeda had scarcely landed before he had an interview with some of the malcontents, inciting them to a rising at Zaragua, and to a determination to expel Columbus. After some skirmishes which had not ended to Ojeda's advantage, a meeting was arranged for him with Roldan, Diego de Escobar, and Juan de la Cosa, when they prevailed upon him to leave the island. He took with him, says Las Casas, a prodigious cargo of slaves whom he sold in the market at Cadiz for enormous sums of money. He returned to Spain in February 1500, where he had been preceded by Americus Vespucius and B. Roldan on the 18th of October 1499. The most southerly point that Ojeda had reached in his voyage was 4 degrees north latitude, and he had only spent 14 weeks on the voyage of discovery, properly so called. If we appear to have dwelt at some length upon this voyage, it is because it was the first one made by Vespucius. Some authors, Varnhagen for instance, and quite recently Mr. H. Major, in his history of Prince Henry the Navigator, assert that Vespucius' first voyage was in 1497, and consequently that he must have seen the American continent before Columbus, but we prefer to follow Humboldt, who spent so many years in studying the history of the discovery of America, in his opinion that 1499 was the right date. Also M. Ed. Charton and M. Jules Codine, the latter of whom discussed this question in the report of the Geographical Society for 1873, apropos of Mr. Major's book. If it were true, says Voltaire, that Vespucius had discovered the American continent, yet the glory would not be his. It belongs undoubtedly to the man who had the genius and courage to undertake the first voyage, to Columbus. As Newton says in his argument with Leibniz, the glory is due only to the inventor. But we agree with M. Codine when he says, how can we allow that there was an expedition in 1497 which resulted in the discovery of above 2,500 miles of the coastline of the mainland, when there is no trace of it left either among the great historians of that time or in the legal dispositions in connection with the claims made by the heir of Columbus against the Spanish government, in which the priority of the discoveries of each leader of an expedition is so carefully mentioned, with the part of the coast explored by each. Finally, the authentic documents extracted from the archives of the Casa de Contratación make it evident that Vespucius was entrusted with the preparation of the vessels destined for the third voyage of Columbus at Seville and at Sanlúcar from the middle of August 1497 till the departure of Columbus on the 30th of May 1498. The narratives of the voyages of Vespucius are very diffuse and wanting in precision and order. The information they give upon the places he visited is so vague that it might apply to one part of the coast as well as to another. As to the localities treated of, as well as of the companions of Vespucius, there are no indications given of a nature to aid the historian. Not a single name is given of any well-known person, and the dates are contradictory in those famous letters which have given endless work to commentators. Humboldt says of them, there is an element of discord in the most authentic documents relating to the Florentine navigator. We have given an account of Ojeda's first voyage, which coincides with that of Vespucius, according to Humboldt, and who has compared the principal incidents of the two narratives. Varnhagen asserts that Vespucius, having started on the 10th of May, 1497, entered the Gulf of Honduras on the 10th of June, coasted by Yucatan and Mexico, sailed up the Mississippi, and at the end of February 1498 doubled the Cape of Florida. After anchoring for 37 days at the mouth of the St. Lawrence, he returned to Cadiz in October 1498. If Vespucius had really made this marvelous voyage, he would have far outstripped all the navigators of his time, and would have fully deserved that his name should be given to the newly discovered continent, whose coastline he had explored for so great a distance. But nothing is less certain, and Humboldt's opinion has hitherto appeared to the best writers to offer the largest amount of probability. Americus Vespucius made 3 other voyages. Humboldt identifies the first with that of Vincent Yanez Pinzon, and M. D'Avezac with that of Diego de Lepe, 1499 to 1500. At the close of this latter year, Giuliano Bartolomeo de Giocondo induced Vespucius to enter the service of Emmanuel, King of Portugal, and he accomplished 2 more voyages at the expense of his new master. On the first of these 2 voyages he was no higher in command than he had been in his earlier ones, and only accompanied the expedition as one whose intimate acquaintance with all nautical matters might prove of service under certain circumstances. During this voyage the ships coasted along the American shores from Cape St. Augustine to 52 degrees of south latitude. The 4th voyage of Vespucius was marked by the wreck of the flagship off the island of Fernando de Noronha, which prevented the other vessels from continuing their voyage towards Malacca by way of the Cape of Good Hope, and obliged the crews to land at All Saints Bay in Brazil. This 4th voyage was unquestionably made with Gonzalo Coelho, but we are quite ignorant as to who was in command on the 3rd voyage. These various expeditions had not tended to enrich Vespucius, while his position at the Portuguese court was so far from satisfactory that he determined to re-enter the service of the King of Spain. By him he was made piloto mayor on the 22nd of March, 1508. There were some valuable emoluments attached for his advantage to this appointment, which enabled him to end his days, if not as a rich man, at least as one far removed from want. He died at Seville on the 22nd of February, 1512, with the same conviction as Columbus that he had reached the shores of Asia. Americus Vespucius is especially famous from the New World having been named after him, instead of being called Columbia, as in all justice it should have been. But with this Vespucius had nothing to do. He was for a long time charged, though most unjustly, with impudence, falsehood, and deceit, it being alleged that he wished to veil the glory of Columbus, and to arrogate himself to the honor of discovery which did not belong to him. This was an utterly unfounded accusation, for Vespucius was both loved and esteemed by Columbus and his contemporaries, and there is nothing in his writings to justify this calumnious assertion. 7 printed documents exist which are attributed to Vespucius. They are the abridged accounts of his 4 voyages, 2 narratives of his 3rd and 4th voyages, in the form of letters addressed to Lorenzo de Pier Francesco de Medici, and a letter addressed to the same nobleman, relatives to the Portuguese discoveries of the Indies. These documents, printed and bound up as small thin volumes, were soon translated into various languages and distributed throughout Europe. It was in the year 1507 that a certain Hylacolymus, whose real name was Martin Waldseemüller, first proposed to give the name of America to the new part of the world. He did so in a book printed in St. Die, called Cosmographia Introductio. In 1509 a small geographical treatise appeared at Strasbourg, adopting the proposal of Hylacolymus, and in 1520 an edition of Pomponius Mela was printed at Basle, giving a map of the New World with the name of America. From this time the number of works employing the denomination proposed by Waldseemüller increased perpetually. Some years later, when Waldseemüller was better informed as to the real discoverer of America, and of the value to be placed upon the voyages of Vespucius, he eliminated from his book all that related to the latter, and substituted everywhere the name of Columbus for that of Vespucius. But it was too late. The same error has prevailed ever since. As to Vespucius himself, it seems very unlikely that he was at all aware of the excitement which prevailed in Europe, nor what was passing at St. Die. The testimony that has unanimously borne to his honorable and upright conduct should surely clear him from the unmerited accusations which have for too long a time clouded his memory. 3 other expeditions left Spain almost at the same time as that of Ojeda. The first of these, consisting of but 1 vessel, sailed from Barra Saltez in June 1499. Pierre Alonso Nino, who had served under Columbus in his 2 last voyages, was its commander, and he was accompanied by Cristobal Guerra, a merchant of Seville, who probably defrayed the expenses of the expedition. The voyage to the coast of Paria seems to have been dictated more by the hope of lucrative commerce than by the interests of science. No new discoveries were made, but the 2 voyages returned to Spain in April 1500, bringing with them so large a quantity of valuable pearls as to excite the cupidity of their countrymen, who became anxious to try their own fortunes in the same direction. The second expedition was commanded by Vincent Yanez Pinzon, the younger brother of Alonso Pinzon, who had been captain of the Pinta, and had shown so much jealousy of Columbus, even adopting the following mendacious device: A Castilla y a León, Nuevo Mundo de Pinzon. Yanez Pinzon, whose devotion to the admiral equaled his brother's jealousy, had advanced an 1/8 part of the funds required for the expedition of 1492, and had on that occasion been in command of the Nina. He set out in December 1499 with 4 vessels, of which only 2 returned to Palos at the end of September 1500. He touched the coast of the newly discovered continent at a point near the shore visited by Ojeda some months before, and explored the coast for some 2,400 miles, discovering Cape St. Augustine at 8 degrees 20 minutes south latitude, following the coastline in a northwesterly direction to Rio Grande, which he named Santa Maria de la Mar Dulce, and continuing in the same direction as far as Cape St. Vincent. Diego de Lepe explored the same coasts with 2 caravels from January to June 1500. There is nothing particular to record of this voyage beyond the very important observation that was made on the direction of the coastline to the continent starting from Cape St. Augustine. Lepe had but just returned to Spain when 2 vessels left Cadiz, equipped by Rodrigo de Bastidas, a wealthy and highly respectable man, with the view of making some fresh discoveries, but above all with the object of collecting as large a quantity of gold and pearls as possible, for which were to be bartered glass beads and other worthless trifles. Juan de la Cosa, whose talents as a navigator were proverbial, and who knew these coasts well from having explored them, was really at the head of the expedition. The sailors went on shore and saw the Rio Sinu, the Gulf of Arabia, and reached the Puerto de Retrete, or de los Escribanos, in the Isthmus of Panama. This harbor was not visited by Columbus till the 26th of November, 1502. It is situated about 17 miles from the once celebrated but now destroyed town of Nombre de Dios. In fact, this expedition, which had been organized by a merchant, became, thanks to Juan de la Cosa, one of the voyages of the most fertile in discoveries. But alas, it came to a sad termination. The vessels were lost in the Gulf of Zaragua, and Bastidas and Las Cosas were obliged to make their way to land by Santo Domingo. When they arrived there, Bovadilla, the upright man and model governor whose infamous conduct to Columbus were already mentioned, had them arrested on the plea that they had brought some gold from the Indians of Zaragua. He sent them off to Spain, which was only reached after a fearfully stormy voyage, some of the vessels being lost on the way. After this expedition, so fruitful in results, voyages of discovery became less frequent for some years, the Spaniards being occupied in asserting their supremacy in the countries in which they had already founded colonies. End of Part 2, Chapter 1, Part 1a. Section number 24 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1, Exploration of the World, by Jules Verne. Part 2, Chapter 1, Part 1b. The colonization of Hispaniola had commenced in 1493, when the town of Isabella was built. 2 years afterwards, Christopher Columbus had traveled over the island and had subjugated the poor savages by means of those terrible dogs which had been trained to hunt Indians. And accustomed as the natives were to any hard work, he had forced on them to toil in the mines. Both Bovadilla and Ovando, treating the Indians as a herd of cattle, had divided them among the colonists as slaves. The cruelty with which this unfortunate people was treated became more and more unbearable. By means of a despicable ambush, Ovando seized the Queen of Zaragua and 300 of her principal subjects, and at a given signal they were all put to the sword without there being any crime adduced against them. For some years, says Robertson, the gold brought into the royal treasury of Spain amounted to about 460,000 pesos, 2,400,000 livres of the currency of Tours, an enormous sum if we take into consideration the great increase in the value of money since the beginning of the 16th century. In 1511, Diego Velázquez conquered Cuba with 300 men, and here again were enacted the terrible scenes of bloodshed and pillage which have rendered the Spanish name so sadly notorious. They cut off the thumbs of the natives, put out their eyes, and poured boiling oil or melted lead into their wounds, even when they did not torture them by burning them over a slow fire to extract from them the secret of the treasures of which they were believed to be the possessors. It was only natural under these circumstances that the population rapidly decreased, and the day was not far off when it would be wholly exterminated. To understand fully the sufferings of this race thus odiously persecuted, the touching and horrible narrative of Las Casas must be read, himself the indefatigable defender of the Indians. In Cuba, the cacique Hathaway was made prisoner and condemned to be burnt. When he was tied to the stake, a Franciscan monk tried to convert him, promising him that if he would only embrace the Christian faith, he would be at once admitted to all the joys of paradise. "Are there any Spaniards in that land of happiness and joy of which you speak?" asked Hathaway. "Yes," replied the monk, "but only those who have been just and good in their lives." "The very best among them can have neither justice nor mercy," said the poor cacique. "I do not wish to go to any place where I should meet a single man of that accursed race." Does not this fact suffice to paint the degree of exasperation to which these unfortunate people had been driven? And these horrors were repeated wherever the Spaniards set foot. We will throw a veil over these atrocities practiced by men who thought themselves civilized, and who pretended that they wished to convert to Christianity, the religion preeminently of love and mercy, a race who were in reality less savage than themselves. In 1504 and 1505, 4 vessels explored the Gulf of Urabia. This was the first voyage in which Juan de la Cosa had the supreme command. This seems, too, to have been about the date of Ojeda's 3rd voyage, when he went to the territory of Coquibacoa, a voyage that certainly was made, as Humboldt says, but of which we have no clear account. In 1509, Juan Diaz de Solis, in concert with Vincent Yanez Pinzon, discovered a vast province since known by the name of Yucatan. Though this expedition was not a very remarkable one in itself, says Robertson, it deserves to be noticed as it led to discoveries of the utmost importance. For the same reason we must mention the voyage of Diego de Ocampo, who, being charged to sail round Cuba, was the first to ascertain that it was a large island, Columbus having always regarded it as part of the continent. 2 years later, Juan Diaz de Solis and Vincent Pinzon, sailing southwards towards the equinoctial line, advanced as far as the 40 degree of south latitude, and found, to their surprise, that the continent extended on their right hand even to this immense distance. They landed several times and took formal possession of the country, but could not found any colonies there on account of the small resources they had at their command. The principal result of this voyage was the more exact knowledge which it gave the extent of this part of the globe. Alonso de Ojeda, whose adventures we have narrated above, was the first to think of founding a colony on the mainland, although he had no means of his own. His courage and enterprising spirit soon gained him associates, who furnished him with the funds needed for carrying out his plans. With the same object, Diego de Nicuesa, a rich colonist of Hispaniola, organized an expedition in 1509. King Ferdinand, who was always lavish of encouragements which cost little, gave both Ojeda and Nicuesa honorable titles and patents of nobility, but not a single maravedis, a Spanish coin. He also divided the newly discovered continent into two governments, of which one was to extend from Cape La Vela to the Gulf of Darien, and the other from the Gulf of Darien to Cape Gracias a Dios. The first was given to Ojeda, the second to Nicuesa. These two conquistadores had to deal with a population far less easy to manage than that of the Antilles. Determined to resist to the utmost the invasion of their country, they adopted means of resistance hitherto unknown to the Spaniards. Thus the strife became deadly. In a single engagement 70 of Ojeda's companions fell under the arrows of the savages. Fearful weapons steeped in curare, so fatal a poison that the slightest wound was followed by death. Nicuesa, on his side, had much difficulty in defending himself, and in spite of 2 considerable reinforcements from Cuba, the greater number of his followers perished during the year from wounds, fatigue, privations, or sickness. The survivors founded the small colony of Santa Maria el Antigua upon the Gulf of Darien and placed it under the command of Balboa. Before we speak of Balboa's wonderful expedition, we must notice the discovery of a country that forms the most northerly side of that arc, cut so deeply into the continent and which bears the name of the Gulf of Mexico. In 1502, Juan Ponce de Leon, a member of one of the oldest families in Spain, had arrived in Hispaniola with Ovando. He had assisted in its subjugation, and in 1508 had conquered the island of San Juan de Puerto Rico. Having learnt from the Indians that there existed a fountain in the island of Bimini which possessed the miraculous powers of restoring youth to all who drank of its waters, Ponce de Leon resolved to go in search of it. Infirmities must have been already creeping on him at 50 years of age, or he would scarcely have felt the need of trying this fountain. Ponce de Leon equipped 3 vessels at his own expense and set out from St. Germain in Puerto Rico on the 1st of March, 1512. He went first to the Lucayan Islands, which he searched in vain, and then to the Bahamas. If he did not succeed in finding the fountain of youth, which he sought so credulously, at least he had the satisfaction of discovering an apparently fertile tract of country, which he named Florida, either from his landing there on Palm Sunday, Pac Flores, or perhaps from its delightful aspect. Such a discovery would have contented many a traveller, but Ponce de Leon went from one island to another, tasting the water of every stream that he met with, without the satisfaction of seeing his white hair again becoming black, or his wrinkles disappearing. After spending 6 months in this fruitless search, he was tired of playing the dupe, so, giving up the business, he returned to Puerto Rico on the 5th of October, leaving Perez de Ortubia and the pilot Antonio de Alaminos to continue the search. Père Charlevoix says, he was the object of great ridicule when he returned in much suffering and looking older than when he set out. This voyage, so absurd in its motive, but so fertile in its results, might well be considered to be simple imaginary, were it not vouched for by historians of such high repute as Peter Martyr, Oviedo, Herrera, and Garcilaso de la Vega. Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who was 15 years younger than Ponce de Leon, had come to America with Bastidas and had settled in Hispaniola. He was only anxious for a safe refuge from his numerous creditors, being, as were so many of his fellow countrymen, deeply in debt, in spite of the repartimiento of Indians which had been allotted to him. Unfortunately for Balboa, a law had been passed forbidding any vessels bound for the mainland taking insolvent debtors on board. But his ingenuity was equal to this emergency, for he had himself rolled in an empty barrel to the vessel which was to carry Encisco to Darien. The chief of the expedition had no choice but to receive the brave adventurer, who had joined them in this singular manner, and who never fled except from Duns, as he soon proved on landing. The Spaniards, accustomed to find but little resistance from the natives of the Antilles, could not subjugate the fierce inhabitants of the mainland. On account of the dissensions that had arisen among themselves, they were obliged to take refuge at Santa Maria el Antigua, a settlement which Balboa, now elected commandant in place of Encisco, founded in Darien. If the personal bravery of Balboa, or the ferocity of Leoncillo, his bloodhound, who was more dreaded than 20 armed men and received the same pay as a soldier, could have awed the Indians, Balboa would have also won their respect by his justice and comparative moderation, for he allowed no unnecessary cruelty. In the course of some years he collected a great mass of the most useful information with regard to that El Dorado, that land of gold which he was destined never to reach himself, but the acquisition of which he did much to facilitate for his successors. It was in this way that he learnt the existence of 6 suns away, 6 days' journey, of another sea, the Pacific Ocean, which washed the shores of Peru, a country where gold was found in large quantities. Balboa's character, which was as grand as those of Cortes and Pizarro, but who had not, as they, the time or opportunity to show the extraordinary qualities which he possessed, felt convinced that this information was most valuable, and that if he could carry out such a discovery, it would shed great luster on his name. He assembled a body of 190 volunteers, all valiant soldiers, and like himself accustomed to all the chances of war, as well as acclimatized to the unhealthy effluvia, or a marshy country where fever, dysentery, and complaints of the liver were constantly present. Though the Isthmus of Darien is only 60 miles in width, it is divided into 2 parts by a chain of high mountains. At the foot of these the alluvial soil is marvelously fertile, and the vegetation far more luxuriant than any European can imagine. It consists of an inextricable mass of tropical plants, creepers, and ferns, among trees of gigantic size, which completely hide the sun, a truly virgin forest, interspersed here and there with patches of stagnant water, where live multitudes of birds, insects, and animals never disturbed by the foot of man. A warm, moist atmosphere exists here which exhausts the strength and speedily saps the energy of any man, even the most robust. With all these obstacles which nature seemed to have rejoiced in placing in Balboa's path, there was yet another no less formidable, and this was the resistance which the savage inhabitants of this inhospitable shore would offer to his progress. Balboa set out without caring for the risk he ran in the event of the guides and native auxiliaries proving faithless. He was escorted by 1,000 Indians as porters, and accompanied by a troop of those terrible bloodhounds which had acquired the taste for human flesh in Hispaniola. Of the tribes that he met with on his route, some fled into the mountains carrying their provisions with them, and others, taking advantage of the difficulties the land presented, tried to fight. Balboa, marching in the midst of his men, never sparing himself, sharing in the privations and rousing their courage, which would have failed more than once, was able to inspire them with so much enthusiasm for the object that was before them, that after 25 days of marching and fighting they could see from the top of a mountain the vast Pacific Ocean, of which 4 days later Balboa, his drawn sword in one hand and the banner of Castile in the other, took possession in the name of the King of Spain. The part of the Pacific Ocean which he had reached is situated to the east of Panama, and still bears the name of the Gulf of San Miguel, given to it by Balboa. The information he obtained from the neighboring caciques, whom he subjugated by force of arms, and from whom he obtained a considerable booty, agreed in every particular with what he had heard before he set out. A vast empire lay to the south, they said, so rich in gold that even the commonest instruments were made of it, where the domestic animals were llamas that had been tamed and trained to carry heavy burdens, and whose appearance in the native drawings resembled that of the camel. These interesting details and the great quantity of pearls offered to Balboa confirmed him in his idea that he must have reached the Asiatic countries described by Marco Polo, and that he could not be far from the empire of Cipango or Japan, of which the Venetian traveller had described the marvellous riches which were perpetually dazzling the eyes of those avaricious adventurers. Balboa several times crossed the Isthmus of Darien, and always in some fresh direction. Humboldt might well say that this country was better known in the beginning of the 16th century than in his own day. Beyond this, Balboa had launched some vessels built under his orders on the newly discovered ocean, and he was preparing a formidable armament with which he hoped to conquer Peru, when he was odiously and judicially murdered by the orders of Pedarius Davila, the governor of Darien, who was jealous of the reputation Balboa had already gained, and of the glory which would doubtless recompense his bravery if he carried out the expedition which he had arranged. Thus the conquest of Peru was retarded by at least 25 years, owing to the culpable jealousy of a man whose name has acquired by Balboa's assassination almost as wretched a celebrity as that of Erostratus. If we owe to Balboa the first authentic documents regarding Peru, another explorer was destined to furnish some not less important touching that vast Mexican empire, which had extended its way over almost the whole of Central America. In 1518, Juan de Grijalva had been placed in command of a flotilla consisting of 4 vessels, armed by Diego Velazquez, the conqueror of Cuba, which were destined to collect information upon Yucatan, cited the year before by Hernandez de Cordova. Grijalva, accompanied by the pilot Alaminos, who had made the voyage to Florida with Ponce de Leon, had 200 men under his command. Amongst the volunteers was Bernal Diaz del Castillo, the clever author of a very interesting history of the conquest of Mexico, from which we shall borrow freely. After 13 days' sailing, Grijalva reached the island of Cozumel on the coast of Yucatan, doubled the Cape of Cotoche, and entered the Bay of Campeche. He disembarked on the 10th of May at Potonchan, of which the inhabitants defended the town and citadel vigorously, in spite of their astonishment at the vessels which they took for some kind of marine monsters, and their fear of the pale-faced men who hurled thunderbolts. 57 Spaniards were killed in the engagement, and many were wounded. This warm reception did not encourage Grijalva to make any long stay amongst this warlike people. He set sail again after anchoring for 4 days, took a westerly course along the coast of Mexico, and on the 19th of May entered a river named by the natives the Tabasco, where he soon found himself surrounded by a fleet of 50 native boats filled with warriors ready for the conflict. But thanks to Grijalva's prudence and the amicable demonstrations which he made, peace was not disturbed. "We made them understand," writes Bernal Diaz, "that we were the subjects of a powerful emperor called Don Carlos, and that it would be greatly to their advantage if they also would acknowledge him as their master. They replied that they had a sovereign already, and were at loss to understand why we, who had only just arrived, and who knew so little of them, should offer them another king." This reply was scarcely that of a savage. In exchange for some worthless European trinkets, the Spaniards obtained some yucca bread, copal gum, pieces of gold worked into the shape of fishes and birds, and garments made of cotton, which had been woven in the country. As the natives who had been taken on board at Cape Cotoche did not perfectly understand the language spoken by the inhabitants of Tabasco, the stay here was but of short duration, and the ships again put to sea. They passed the mouth of the Rio Guatzacoalco, the snowy peaks of the San Martin Mountains being seen in the distance, and they anchored at the mouth of a river which was called Rio de las Banderas, from the number of white banners displayed by the natives to show their friendly feeling toward the newcomers. When Grijalva landed, he was received with the same honor as the Indians paid to their gods. They burnt copal incense before them and laid at his feet more than 1,500 piastres worth of small gold jewels, as well as green pearls and copper hatchets. After taking formal possession of the country, the Spaniards landed on an island called Los Sacrificios Island, from a sort of altar which they found there placed at the top of several steps, upon which lay the bodies of 5 Indians, sacrificed since the preceding evening. Their bodies were cut open, their hearts torn out, and both legs and arms cut off. Leaving this revolting spectacle, they went to another small island, which received the name of San Juan, being discovered on St. John's Day. To this they added the word Culua, which they heard used by the natives of these shores. But Culua was the ancient name for Mexico, and this island of San Juan de Culua is now known as St. John de Ulloa. Grijalva put all the gold which he had collected on board one of the ships and dispatched it to Cuba, while he continued his exploration of the coast, discovered the sierras of Tusta and Tuspa, and collected a large amount of useful information regarding this populous country. On arriving at Rio Panuco, he was attacked by a flotilla of native vessels, and had much difficulty in defending himself against their attacks. This expedition was nearly over, for provisions were running short, and the vessels were in a very bad state. The volunteers were many of them sick and wounded, and even had they been in good health, their numbers were too small to make it safe to leave them among these warlike people, even under the shelter of fortifications. Besides, the leaders of the expedition no longer acted in concert. So after repairing the largest of the vessels in Rio Tonala, where Bernal Diaz boasts of having sown the first orange pips which were ever brought to Mexico, the Spaniards set out for Santiago in Cuba, where they arrived on the 15th of November, after a cruise of 7 months, not 45 days, as M. Ferdinand Denis asserts in the Biography d'Ido, and as M. Ed Charnton repeats in his Voyageurs Anciens et Modernes. The results obtained from this voyage were considerable. For the first time, the long line of coast which forms the peninsula of Yucatan, the Bay of Campeche, and the base of the Gulf of Mexico had been explored continuously from cape to cape. Not only had it been proved beyond doubt that Yucatan was not an island, as they had believed, but much and reliable information had been collected with regard to the existence of the rich and powerful empire of Mexico. The explorers had been much struck with the marks of a more advanced civilization than that existing in the Antilles, with the superiority of the architecture, the skillful cultivation of the land, the fine texture of the cotton garments, and the delicacy of finish of the golden ornaments worn by the Indians. All this combined to increase the thirst for riches among the Spaniards of Cuba, and to urge them on, like modern Argonauts, to the conquest of this golden fleece. Grijalva was not destined to reap the fruits of his perilous and at the same time intelligent voyage, which threw so new a light on Indian civilization. The sic vos non vobis of the poet was once again to find an exemplification in this circumstance. End of Part 2, Chapter 1, Part 1b.
Section 25 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jonathan Drury. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. Second Part, Chapter 1, Part 2a. Velasquez had not waited for Grijalva's return before sending off to Spain the rich products of the countries discovered by the latter, and at the same time soliciting from the Council of the Indies, as well as from the Bishop of Burgos, an addition to his authority, that he might attempt the conquest of these countries. At the same time he fitted out a new armament proportioned to the dangers and importance of the undertaking that he proposed. But though it was comparatively easy for Velasquez to collect the necessary material and men, it was far more difficult for him, whom an old writer describes as niggardly, credulous, and suspicious in disposition, to choose a fit leader. He wished, indeed, to find one who should combine qualities nearly always incompatible, high courage and great talent, without which there was no chance of success, with at the same time sufficient docility and submissiveness to do nothing without orders, and to leave to him who incurred no risk any glory and success which might attend the enterprise. Some who were brave and enterprising would not be treated as mere machines. Others who were more docile or more cunning lacked the qualities required to ensure the success of so vast an enterprise. Among the former were some of Grijalva's companions, who wished that he should be made commander, while the latter preferred Agustin Bermudez or Bernardino Velasquez. While this was pending, the governor's secretary, Andrés de Duero, and Amador de Lares, the controller of Cuba, both favorites of Velasquez, made an arrangement with a Spanish nobleman named Ferdinand Cortez, that if they could obtain the appointment for him, they should be allowed a share in his gains. Bernal Diaz says, they praised Cortez so highly, and pointed him out in such flattering terms as the very man fitted to fill the vacant post, adding that he was brave and certainly very faithful to Velasquez, to whom he was a son-in-law, that he allowed himself to be persuaded, and Cortez was nominated captain general. As Andrés de Duero was the governor's secretary, he hastened to formulate the powers in a deed, making them very ample, as Cortez desired, and brought it to him duly signed. Had Velasquez been gifted with the power of looking into the future, Cortez was certainly not the man he would have chosen. Cortez was born at Medellin in Extremadura in 1485, of an ancient but slenderly endowed family. After studying at Salamanca for some time, he returned to his native town, but the quiet monotonous life there was little suited to his restless and capricious temper, and he soon started for America, reckoning upon the protection of his relation Ovando, the governor of Hispaniola. His expectations were fully realized, and he held several honorable and lucrative posts, without counting that between times he joined in several expeditions against the natives. If he became in this manner initiated into the Indian system of tactics, so also, unfortunately, did he grow familiar with those acts of cruelty which have too often stained the Castilian name. He accompanied Diego de Velasquez in his Cuban expedition in 1511, and here he distinguished himself so highly, that notwithstanding certain disagreements with his chief, a large grant of land as well as of Indians was made to him as a recognition of his services. Cortez amassed the sum of 3,000 castellanos in the course of a few years by his industry and frugality, a large sum for one in his position, but his chief recommendations in the eyes of Andrés de Duero and Amador de Sarez, his two patrons, were his activity, his well-known prudence, his decision of character, and the power of gaining the confidence of all with whom he was brought into contact. In addition to all this, he was of imposing stature and appearance, very athletic, and possessed powers of endurance remarkable even among the hardy adventurers who were accustomed to brave all kinds of hardships. As soon as Cortez had received his commission, which he did with every mark of respectful gratitude, he set up a banner at the door of his house, made of black velvet embroidered with gold, bearing the device of a red cross in the midst of blue and white flames, and below this motto in Latin: "Friends, let us follow the cross, and if we have faith, we shall overcome by this sign." He concentrated the whole force of his powerful mind upon the means to make the enterprise a success. Even his most intimate friends were astonished at his enthusiasm in preparing for it. He not only gave the whole of the money which he possessed toward arming the fleet, but he charged part on his estate, and borrowed considerable sums from his friends to purchase vessels, provisions, munitions of war, and horses. In a few days 300 volunteers had enrolled themselves, attracted by the fame of the general, the daring nature of the enterprise, and the profit that would probably accrue from it. Velasquez, always suspicious, and doubtless instigated by some who were jealous of Cortez, tried to put a stop to the expedition at its outset. Cortez, being warned by his two patrons that Velasquez would probably try to take the command from him, acted with his customary decision. He collected his men, and in spite of the vessels not being completed and of an insufficient armament, he weighed anchor and sailed during the night. When Velasquez discovered that his plans had been checkmated, he concealed his indignation, but at the same time he made every arrangement to stop the man who could thus throw off all dependence upon him with such consummate coolness. Cortez anchored at Macaca to complete his stores, and found many of those who had accompanied Grijalva now hastened to serve under his banner. Pedro de Alvarado and his brothers, Cristobal de Olid, Alonso de Avila, Hernandez de Portocarrero, Gonzalo de Sandoval, and Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was to write a valuable account of these events, Quorum pars magna fuit. Trinity Harbor, on the south coast of Cuba, was the next resting place, and here a further supply of provisions was taken on board. But while Cortes lay at anchor for this purpose, Verdugo, the governor, received letters from Velasquez, desiring him to arrest the captain general, the command of the fleet having just been taken from him. This bold step would have endangered the safety of the town, so Verdugo refrained from executing the order. Cortes sailed away to Havana in order to enlist some new adherents, while his lieutenant Alvarado went overland to the port where the last preparations were made. Although Velasquez was unsuccessful in his first attempt, he again sent an order to arrest Cortes, but Pedro Barba, the governor, felt the impossibility of executing the order in the midst of soldiers who, as Bernal Diaz said, would have willingly given their lives to save Cortes. At length, having recalled the volunteers by beat of drum, and taken on board all that appeared necessary, Cortes set sail on the 18th February, 1519, with 11 ships, the largest being of 100 tons, 110 sailors, 553 soldiers, 13 of whom were arquebusiers, 200 Indians from the island, and some women for domestic work. The real strength of the armament lay in the 10 pieces of artillery, the 4 falconets provided with an ample supply of ammunition, and the 16 horses which had been obtained at great expense. It was with these almost miserable means, which however had given Cortes much trouble to collect, that he prepared to wage war with a sovereign whose dominions were of greater extent than those appertaining to the King of Spain, an enterprise from which he would have turned back if he had foreseen half its difficulties. But long ago a poet said, "Fortune smiles on those who dare." After encountering a very severe storm, the fleet touched at the island of Cozumel, where they found that the inhabitants had embraced Christianity, either from fear of the Spaniards, or from finding the inability of their gods to help them. Just as the fleet was about to leave the island, Cortes had the good fortune to meet with a Spaniard named Geronimo de Aguilar, who had been kept a prisoner by the Indians for 8 years. During that time he had learnt the Indian language perfectly. He was as prudent as he was clever, and when he joined the expedition he was of the greatest use as an interpreter. After doubling Cape Catoche, Cortes sailed down the Bay of Campeche, passed Potonchan, and entered the Rio Tabasco, hoping to meet with as friendly a reception there as Grijalva had done, and also to collect an equally large quantity of gold. But he found a great change had taken place in the feelings of the natives, and he was obliged to employ force. In spite of the bravery and numerical superiority of the Indians, the Spaniards overcame them in several engagements, thanks to the terror caused by the reports of their firearms and the sight of the cavalry, whom the Indians took for supernatural beings. The Indians lost a large number of men in these engagements, while among the Spaniards 2 were killed and 14 men and several horses wounded. The wounds of the latter were dressed with fat taken from the dead bodies of the Indians. At last peace was made, and the natives gave Cortes provisions, some cotton clothing, a small quantity of gold, and 20 female slaves, among whom was the celebrated Marina, who rendered such signal services to the Spaniards as an interpreter, and who was mentioned by all the historians of the conquest of the New World. Cortes continued on a westerly course, seeking a suitable place for landing, but he could find none until he reached St. John de Ulua. The fleet had scarcely cast anchor before a canoe made its way fearlessly to the admiral's vessel, and here Marina, who was of Aztec origin, was of greatest use, in telling Cortes that the Indians of this part of the country were the subjects of a great empire, and that their province was one recently added to it by conquest. Their monarch, named Moctezuma, better known under the name of Montezuma, lived in Tenochtitlan, or Mexico, nearly 210 miles away in the interior. Cortes offered the Indians some presents, assuring them of his pacific intentions, and then disembarked upon the torrid and unhealthy shore of Vera Cruz. Provisions flowed in immediately, but the day after the landing, Teutile, governor of the province, and ambassador of Montezuma to the Spaniards, had much difficulty in answering Cortes when he asked him to conduct him to his master without delay, knowing as he did all the anxiety and fears which had haunted the mind of the emperor since the arrival of the Spaniards. However, he caused some cotton stuffs, feather cloaks, and some articles made of gold to be laid at the feet of the general, a sight which simply excited the cupidity of the Europeans. To give these poor Indians an adequate idea of his power, Cortes called out his soldiers, and put them through their drill. He also ordered the discharge of some pieces of artillery, the noise of which froze the hearts of the savages with terror. During the whole time of the interview, some painters had been employed in sketching upon pieces of white cotton the ships, the troops, and everything which had struck their fancy. These drawings, very cleverly executed, were to be sent to Montezuma. But before beginning the history of the heroic struggles which shortly commenced, it will be useful to give some details as to that Mexican empire which, powerful as it appeared, nevertheless contained within itself numerous elements of decay and dissolution, which fact explains the cause of its conquest by a mere handful of adventurers. That part of America which was under the dominion of Montezuma was called Anahuac, and lay between 14 degrees and 20 degrees north latitude. This region presents great varieties of climate on account of its difference of altitude. Toward the center, and rather nearer to the Pacific than to the Atlantic, there is a huge basin at an elevation of 7,500 feet above the sea, and about 200 miles in circumference, in the hollow of which there were at the time several lakes. This depression is called the Valley of Mexico, taking its name from the capital of the empire. As may be easily supposed, we possess very few authentic details about a people whose written annals were burnt by the ignorant conquistadores, and by fanatical monks, who jealously suppressed everything which might remind the conquered race of their ancient religious and political traditions. Arriving from the north in the 7th century, the Toltecs had overspread the plateau of Anahuac. They were an intelligent race of people, addicted to agriculture and the mechanical arts, understanding the working in metals, and to whom is due the construction of the greater part of the sumptuous and gigantic edifices of which the ruins are found in every direction in New Spain. After 4 centuries of power, the Toltecs disappeared from the country as mysteriously as they had come. A century later they were replaced by a savage tribe from the northwest, who were soon followed by more civilized races, speaking apparently the Toltec language. The most celebrated of these tribes were the Aztecs, and the Alcolhues, or Tezcucans, who assimilated themselves easily with the tincture of civilization which remained in the country with the last of the Toltecs. The Aztecs, after a series of migrations and wars, settled themselves in 1326 in the Valley of Mexico, where they built their capital Tenochtitlan. A treaty of alliance, both offensive and defensive, was entered into between the states of Mexico, Tezcuco, and Tlacopan, and was rigorously observed for a whole century. In consequence of this Aztec civilization, which had been at first bounded by the extent of the valley, spread on all sides, and soon was limited only by the Pacific and Atlantic oceans. In a short time these people had reached a higher degree of civilization than any other tribe in the New World. The rights of property were recognized in Mexico, commerce flourished there, and 3 kinds of coin in circulation provided the ordinary mechanism of exchange. There was a well-organized police, and a system of relays which worked with perfect regularity, and enabled the sovereign to transmit his orders with rapidity from one end of the empire to the other. The number and beauty of the towns, the great size of the palaces, temples, and fortresses indicated an advanced civilization, which presented a singular contrast to the ferocious manners of the Aztecs. Their polytheistic religion was in the highest degree barbarous and sanguinary. The priests formed a very numerous body, and exercised great influence even over political affairs. Side by side with rites similar to those of Christians, such as baptism and confession, the religion presented a tissue of the most absurd and bloody superstitions. The offering up of human sacrifices, adopted at the beginning of the 14th century, and used at first very sparingly, had soon become so frequent that the number of victims immolated each year, and drawn chiefly from the conquered nations, amounted to 20,000, while under certain circumstances the number was much larger. Thus in 1486, at the inauguration of the temple of Huitzilopochtli, 70,000 captives perished in a single day. The government of Mexico was monarchical. At first the imperial power had been carefully limited, but it had increased with the various conquests and had become despotic. The sovereign was always chosen out of the same family, and his accession was marked by the offering up of numerous human sacrifices. The Emperor Montezuma belonged to the sacerdotal caste, and in consequence his power received some unwonted development. The result of his numerous wars had been the extension of his frontiers, and the subjugation of various nations. These latter welcomed the Spaniards with eagerness, thinking that their dominion must surely be less oppressive and less cruel than that of the Aztecs. It is certain that if Montezuma, with the large force which he had at his disposal, had fallen upon the Spaniards when they were occupying the hot and unhealthy shore of Vera Cruz, they would have been unable, in spite of the superiority of their arms and discipline, to resist such a shock. They must all have perished, or been obliged to re-embark, and the fate of the New World would have been completely changed. But the decision which formed the most salient point in the character of Cortez was completely wanting in that of Montezuma, a prince who never could at any time adopt a resolute policy. Fresh ambassadors from the emperor had arrived at the Spanish camp, bringing to Cortez an order to quit the country, and upon his refusal all intercourse between the natives and the invaders had immediately ceased. The situation was becoming critical, and this Cortez felt. After having overcome some hesitation which had been shown by the troops, he laid the foundations of Vera Cruz, a fortress designed to serve as a basis of operations, and a shelter in case of a possible re-embarkation. He next organized a kind of civil government, a junta as it would be called in the present day, to which he resigned the commission which had been revoked by Velasquez, and then he made the junta give him one with new provisions and more extended powers. After this he received the envoys from the town of Zempoalla, who were coming to solicit his alliance, and his protection against Montezuma, whose dominion they bore with impatience. Cortez was indeed fortunate in meeting with such allies so soon after landing, and not wishing to allow so golden an opportunity to slip, he welcomed the Totonacs kindly, went with them to their capital, and after having caused a fortress to be constructed at Quiabislan on the seashore, he persuaded his new friends to refuse the payment of tribute to Montezuma. He took advantage of his stay at Zempoalla to exhort these people to embrace Christianity, and he threw down their idols, as he had already done at Cozumel, to prove to them the powerlessness of their gods. Meanwhile a plot had been forming in his own camp, and Cortez, feeling convinced that as long as there remained any way of returning to Cuba, there would be constant lukewarmness and discontent among his soldiers, caused all his ships to be run aground under the pretext of their being in too shattered a condition to be of any further use. This was an unheard of act of audacity, and one which forced his companions either to conquer or to die. Having no longer anything to fear from the want of discipline of his troops, Cortez set out for Zempoalla on the 16th of August with 500 soldiers, 15 horses, and 6 field cannon, and also 200 Indian porters, who were intended to perform all menial offices. The little army soon reached the frontiers of the small republic of Tlascala, of which the fierce inhabitants, impatient of servitude, had long been engaged in strife with Montezuma. Cortez flattered himself that his oft-proclaimed intention of delivering the Indians from the Mexican yoke would induce the Tlascalans to become his allies and at once to make common cause with him. He therefore asked for leave to cross their territory on his way to Mexico, but his ambassadors were detained, and as he advanced into the interior of the country, he was harassed for 14 consecutive days and nights by continual attacks from several bodies of Tlascalans, amounting in all to 30,000 men, who displayed a bravery and determination such as the Spaniards had never yet seen equalled in the New World. But the arms possessed by these brave men were very primitive. What could they effect with only arrows and lances tipped with obsidian or fish bones, stakes hardened in the fire, wooden swords, and above all with an inferior system of tactics? When they found that each encounter cost them the lives of many of their bravest warriors, while not a single Spaniard had been killed, they imagined that these strangers must be of a superior order of beings, while they could not tell what opinion to form of men who sent back to them the spies taken in their camp, with their hands cut off, and who yet after each victory not only did not devour their prisoners, as the Aztecs would have done, but released them, loading them with presents and proposing peace. Upon this the Tlascalans declared themselves vassals of the Spanish crown, and swore to assist Cortez in all his expeditions, while he on his side promised to protect them against their enemies. It was time that peace should be made, for many of the Spaniards were wounded or ill, and all were worn out with fatigue, but the entry in triumph into Tlascala, where they were welcomed as supernatural beings, quickly made them forget their sufferings. After 20 days of repose in this town, Cortez resumed his march towards Mexico, having with him an auxiliary army of 6,000 Tlascalans. He went first to Cholula, a town regarded as sacred by the Indians, and as the sanctuary and favored residence of their deities. Montezuma felt much satisfaction in the advance of the Spaniards to this town, either from the hope that the gods would themselves avenge the desecration of their temples, or that he thought a rising and massacre of the Spaniards might be more easily organized in this populous and fanatical town. Cortez had been warned by the Tlascalans that he must place no trust in the protestations of friendship and devotion made by the Cholulans. However, he took up his quarters in the town, considering that he would lose his prestige if he showed any signs of fear. But upon being informed by the Tlascalans that the women and children were being sent away, and by Marina that a considerable body of troops was massed at the gates of the city, that pitfalls and trenches were dug in the streets, whilst the roofs of the houses were loaded with stones and missiles, Cortez anticipated the designs of his enemies, gave orders to make prisoners of all the principal men of the town, and then organized a general massacre of the population, thus taken by surprise and deprived of their leaders. For 2 whole days the unhappy Cholulans were subject to all the horrors which could be invented by the rage of the Spaniards, and the vengeance of their allies the Tlascalans. A terrible example was made, 6,000 people being put to the sword, temples burned to the ground, and the town half destroyed, a work of destruction well calculated to strike terror into the hearts of Montezuma and his subjects. End of second part, Chapter 1, Part 2A. Recording by Jonathan Drury, Los Angeles, California. Section 26 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jonathan Drury. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. Second Part, Chapter 1, Part 2b. 60 miles now separated Cortez from the capital, and everywhere as he passed along he was received as a liberator. There was not a cacique who had not some cause of complaint against the imperial despotism, and Cortez felt confirmed in the hope that so divided an empire would prove an easy prey. As the Spaniards descended from the mountains of Chalco, they beheld with astonishment the valley of Mexico, with its enormous lake, deeply sunk and surrounded by large towns, the capital city built upon piles, and the well-cultivated fields of this fertile region. Cortez did not trouble himself about the continued tergiversations of Montezuma, who could not make up his mind to the last moment whether he would receive the Spaniards as friends or enemies. The Spanish general advanced along the causeway which leads to Mexico across the lake, and was already within a mile of the town, when some Indians, who from their magnificent costume were evidently of high rank, came to greet him and to announce to him the approach of the emperor. Montezuma soon appeared, borne upon the soldiers of his favorites in a kind of litter adorned with gold and feathers, while a magnificent canopy protected him from the rays of the sun. As he advanced the Indians prostrated themselves before him, with their heads downward, as though unworthy even to look at their monarch. This first interview was cordial, and Montezuma himself conducted his guests to the abode which he had prepared for them. It was a vast palace, surrounded by a stone wall, and defended by high towers. Cortez immediately took measures of defence, and ordered the cannon to be pointed upon the roads leading to the palace. At the second interview, magnificent presents were offered both to the general and soldiers. Montezuma related that according to an old tradition, the ancestors of the Aztecs had arrived in the country under the leadership of a man of white complexion, and bearded like the Spaniards. After laying the foundations of their power, he had embarked upon the ocean, promising them that one day his descendants would come to visit them and to reform their laws, and if, as Montezuma said, he now received the Spaniards rather as fathers than as foreigners, it was because he felt convinced that in them he beheld the descendants of his people's ancient chief, and he begged them to regard themselves as the masters of his country. The following days were employed in visiting the town, which appeared to the Spaniards as larger, more populous, and more beautiful than any city which they had hitherto seen in America. Its distinguishing peculiarity consisted in the causeways which formed a means of communication with the land, and which were cut through in various places to allow a free passage to vessels sailing on the waters of the lake. Across these openings were thrown bridges which could be easily destroyed. On the eastern side of the town there was no causeway and no means of communication with the land except by canoes. This arrangement of the town of Mexico caused some anxiety to Cortez, who saw that he might be at any moment blockaded in the town, without being able to find means of egress. He determined therefore to prevent any seditious attempt by securing the person of the emperor, and using him as a hostage. The following news which he had just received furnished him with an excellent pretext. Qualpopoca, a Mexican general, had attacked the provinces which had submitted to the Spaniards, and Escalante and 7 of his soldiers had been mortally wounded. Besides this, a prisoner had been beheaded and the head carried from town to town, thus proving that the invaders could be conquered, and were nothing more than ordinary mortals. Cortez profited by these events to accuse the emperor of perfidy. He declared that although Montezuma appeared friendly to him and to his soldiers, it was only that he might wait for some favorable opportunity to treat them in the same manner as Escalante, a proceeding quite unworthy of a monarch, and very different from the confidence which Cortez had shown in coming, as he had done, to visit him. He went on to say that if the suspicions of the Spaniards were not justified, the emperor could easily exonerate himself by having Qualpopoca punished, and finally, to prevent the recurrence of aggression which could but destroy the existing harmony, and to prove to the Mexicans that he harbored no ill design against the Spaniards, Montezuma could not do otherwise than come to reside amongst them. It may be easily imagined that the emperor was not very ready to decide upon this course, but was at last obliged to give in to the violence and threats of the Spaniards. Upon announcing his resolution to his subjects, he was made to assure them several times over that he put himself into the hands of the Spaniards of his own free will. These words were needed to calm the Mexicans, who threatened to make an attack upon the foreigners. The success of Cortez in this bold scheme was quite beyond his expectations. Qualpopoca, with his son and 5 of the chief ringleaders in the revolt, were seized by the Mexicans and brought before a Spanish tribunal, which was at the same time judge and prosecutor. The Indians were condemned and burnt alive. Not content with having punished men who had committed no crime but that of executing the orders of their emperor, and of opposing an armed resistance to the invasion of their country, Cortez imposed a new humiliation upon Montezuma, in placing fetters upon his feet, under the pretext that the culprits in their last moments had made accusations against him. For 6 months the conquistador exercised the supreme government in the name of the emperor, now reduced to a puppet show of authority. Cortez changed the governors who displeased him, collected the taxes, presided over all the details of the administration, and sent Spaniards into the various provinces of the empire with orders to examine their productions, and to take particular notice of the mining districts and the processes in use for collecting gold. Cortez also turned to account the curiosity evinced by Montezuma to see European ships, to have rigging and other appurtenances brought from Vera Cruz, and to order the construction of 2 brigantines destined to ensure his communications with terra firma by the waters of the lake. Emboldened by receiving so many proofs of submission and humility, Cortez took another step in advance, and required that Montezuma should declare himself the vassal and tributary of Spain. The act of fidelity and homage was accompanied, as may be easily imagined, with presents both rich and numerous, as well as by a heavy tax which was levied without much difficulty. The opportunity was now taken to gather together everything in gold and silver which had been extorted from the Indians, and to melt them down, except certain pieces which were kept as they were on account of the beauty of the workmanship. The whole did not amount to more than 600,000 pesos, or 100,000 L. Thus, although the Spaniards had made use of all their power, and Montezuma had exhausted his treasures to satisfy them, the whole product amounted to an absurdly small sum, very little in accordance with the idea which the conquerors had formed of the riches of the country. After reserving 1/5 of the treasure for the king, and 1/5 for Cortez, and subtracting enough to reimburse the sums which had been advanced for the expenses of the expedition, the share of each soldier did not amount to 100 pesos, and they considered that it would have been more worth their while to have remained in Hispaniola than to have experienced such fatigues, encountered such great dangers, and suffered so many privations, all for the reward of 100 pesos. If the promises of Cortez ended in this beggarly result, and if the partition had been made with fairness, of which they did not feel certain, they argued that it was absurd to remain longer in so poor a country, while under a chief less prodigal in promises, but more generous, they might go to countries rich in gold and precious stones, where brave warriors would find an adequate compensation for their toils. So murmured these greedy adventurers, some accepting what fell to their share while fuming over its small amount, others disdainfully refusing it. Cortez had succeeded in persuading Montezuma to conform to his will in everything which concerned politics, but it was otherwise in regard to religion. He could not persuade him to change his creed, and when Cortez wished to throw down the idols, as he had done at Zempoalla, a tumult arose which would have become very serious had he not immediately abandoned his project. From that time the Mexicans, who had offered scarcely any resistance to the subjugation and imprisonment of their monarch, resolved to avenge their outraged deities, and they prepared a simultaneous rising against the invaders. It was at this juncture, when the affairs in the interior seemed to be taking a less favourable turn, that Cortez received news from Vera Cruz that several ships were cruising off the harbour. At first he thought this must be a fleet sent to his aid by Charles V., in answer to a letter which he had sent to him on the 16th of July, 1519, by Puerto Carrero and Montejo. But he was soon undeceived, and learnt that this expedition was organized by Diego Velasquez, who knew by experience how lightly his lieutenant could shake off all dependence upon him. He had sent this armament with the object of deposing Cortez from his command, and of making him a prisoner, and of carrying him off to Cuba, where he would be speedily placed upon his trial. The fleet thus sent was under the command of Pamfilo de Narvaez. It consisted of 18 vessels, and carried 80 horse soldiers and 100 infantry, of whom 80 were musketeers, 120 crossbowmen, and 12 cannons. Narvaez disembarked without opposition, near the fort of San Juan de Ulloa, but upon summoning of the governor of Vera Cruz, Sandoval, to give up the town to him, Sandoval seized the men who were charged with the insolent message, and sent them off to Mexico, where Cortez at once released them, and then gained from them circumstantial information as to the forces and the projects of Narvaez. The personal danger of Cortez at this moment was great. The troops sent by Velasquez were more numerous and better furnished with arms and ammunition than were his own, but his deepest cause of anxiety was not the possibility of his own condemnation and death. It was the fear lest all fruit of his efforts might be lost, and the knowledge of the hurtfulness of these dissensions to his country's cause. The situation was a critical one, but after mature reflection and careful weighing of arguments for and against the course he meditated, Cortez determined to fight, even at a disadvantage, rather than to sacrifice his conquests and the interests of Spain. Before proceeding to this last extremity, he sent his chaplain Olmedo to Narvaez, but he was very ill received, and saw all his proposals for an accommodation disdainfully rejected. Olmedo met with more success amongst the soldiers, who, most of them, knew him, and to whom he distributed a number of chains, gold rings, and other jewels, which were well calculated to give them a high idea of the riches of the conqueror. But, when Narvaez heard of what was going on, he determined not to leave his troops any longer exposed to temptation. He set a price upon the heads of Cortez and his principal officers, and advanced to the encounter. Cortez, however, was too skilful to be enticed into giving battle under unfavorable circumstances. He temporized and succeeded in tiring out Narvaez and his troops, who retired to Zempoalla. Then Cortez, having taken his measures with consummate prudence, and the surprise and terror of a nocturnal attack which he organized compensating for the inferiority of his troops, he made prisoners of his enemy and all his soldiers, his own loss amounting to but 2 men. The conqueror treated the vanquished well, and gave them the choice between returning to Cuba or remaining to share his fortune. This latter proposal, backed up as it was by gifts and promises, appeared so seductive to the new arrivals, that Cortez found himself at the head of 1,000 soldiers, the day after he had been in danger of falling into the hands of Narvaez. This rapid change of fortune was turned to the greatest advantage by the skilful diplomacy of Cortez, who hastened to return to Mexico. The troops whom he had left there under the command of Alvarado, to guard the emperor and the treasure, were reduced to the last extremity by the natives, who had killed or wounded a great number of soldiers, and who kept the rest in a state of close blockade, while threatening them constantly with a general assault. It must be confessed that the imprudent and criminal conduct of the Spaniards, and notably the massacre of the most distinguished citizens of the emperor during a fête, had brought about the rising which they dreaded, and which they had hoped to prevent. After having been joined by 2,000 Tlascalans, Cortez pressed forward by forced marches towards the capital, where he arrived in safety, and found that the Indians had not destroyed the bridges belonging to the causeways and dikes which joined Mexico to the land. In spite of the arrival of this reinforcement, the situation did not improve. Each day it was necessary to engage in new combats, and to make sorties to clear the avenues leading to the palace occupied by the Spaniards. Cortez now saw but too plainly the mistake which he had made in shutting himself up in a town where his position might be stormed at any moment, and from which it was so difficult to extricate himself. In this difficulty he had recourse to Montezuma, who, by virtue of his authority and of the prestige which still clung to him, could appease the tumult, give the Spaniards some respite, and enable them to prepare for their retreat. But when the unfortunate emperor, now become a mere toy in the hands of the Spaniards, appeared upon the walls decked out with regal ornaments, and implored his subjects to cease from hostilities, murmurs of discontent arose, and threats were freely uttered. Hostilities began afresh, and before the soldiers had time to protect him with their shields, Montezuma was pierced with arrows, and hit upon the head by a stone which knocked him down. At this sight the Indians, horrified at the crime which they had just committed, at once ceased fighting, and fled in all directions, while the emperor, understanding but too late all the baseness of the part which Cortez had forced him to play, tore off the bandages which had been applied to his wounds, and refusing all nourishment, he died cursing the Spaniards. After so fatal an event, there was no more room to hope for peace with the Mexicans, and it became necessary to retire in haste, and at whatever cost, from a town in which the Spaniards were threatened with blockade and starvation. For this retreat Cortez was preparing in secret. He saw his troops each day more and more closely hemmed in, while several times he was forced himself to take his sword in his hand and to fight like a common soldier. Solis even relates, but upon what authority is not known, that during an assault which was made upon one of the edifices commanding the Spanish quarter, 2 young Mexicans, recognizing Cortez, who was cheering on his soldiers, resolved to sacrifice themselves in the hope of killing the man who had been the author of their country's calamities. They approached him in a suppliant attitude, as though they would ask for quarter. Then, seizing him round the waist, they dragged him toward the battlements, over which they threw themselves, hoping to drag him over with them. But thanks to his exceptional strength and agility, Cortez managed to escape from their embrace, and these 2 brave Mexicans perished in the generous but vain attempt to save their country. The retreat being determined on, it was necessary to decide upon whether it should be carried out by night or by day. If in the daytime the enemy would be more easily resisted, and ambuscades which might be prepared would be more easily avoided, while they could better take precautions to repair any bridges broken by the Mexicans. On the other hand, it was known that the Indians will seldom attack an enemy after sunset, but what really decided Cortez in favor of a nocturnal retreat was, that a soldier who dabbled in astrology had declared to his comrades that success was certain if they acted in the night. They therefore began their march at midnight. Besides the Spanish troop, Cortez had under his orders detachments from Tlascala, Zempoalla, and Cholula, which, notwithstanding the serious losses which had been sustained, still numbered 7,000 men. Sandoval commanded the vanguard, and Cortez the center, where were the cannon, baggage, and prisoners, amongst whom were a son and 2 daughters of Montezuma. Alvarado and Velasquez de Leon led the rearguard. With the army was carried a flying bridge, which had been constructed to throw over any gaps there might be in the causeway. Scarcely had the Spaniards debouched upon the dike leading to Tacuba, which was the shortest of all, when they were attacked in front, flank, and rear by solid masses of the enemy, whilst from a fleet of numberless canoes, a perfect hailstorm of stones and missiles fell upon them. Blinded and amazed, the allies knew not against whom to defend themselves first. The wooden bridge sank under the weight of the artillery and fighting men. Crowded together upon a narrow causeway where they could not use their firearms, deprived of their cavalry who had not room to act, mingled with the Indians in a hand-to-hand combat, not having strength to kill, and surrounded on all sides, the Spaniards and their allies gave way under the ever-renewed numbers of the assailants. Officers and soldiers, infantry and cavalry, Spaniards and Tlascalans were confounded together, each defending himself to the best of his ability, without caring about discipline or the common safety. All seemed lost, when Cortez with 100 men succeeded in crossing the breach in the dike upon the mass of corpses which filled it up. He drew up his soldiers in order as they arrived, and putting himself at the head of those least severely wounded, plunged wedge fashion into a melee, and succeeded in disengaging from it a portion of his men. Before day dawned, all those who had succeeded in escaping from the massacre of the Noche Triste, as this terrible night was called, found themselves reunited at Tacuba. It was with eyes full of tears that Cortez passed in review his remaining soldiers, all covered with wounds, and took account of the losses which he had sustained. 4,000 Indians, Tlascalans, and Cholulans, and nearly all the horses were killed. All the artillery and ammunition, as well as the greatest part of the baggage, were lost, and amongst the dead were several officers of distinction, Velasquez de Leon, Salcedo, Morla, Lares, and many others. One of those most dangerously hurt was Alvarado, but not one man, whether officer or soldier, was without a wound. The fugitives did not delay at Tacuba, and by accident they took the road to Tlascala, where they did not know what reception might await them. Ever harassed by the Mexicans, the Spaniards were again obliged to give battle upon the plains of Otumba to a number of warriors, whom some historians reckon at 200,000. Thanks to the presence of some cavalry soldiers who still remained to him, Cortez was able to overthrow all who were in front of him, and to reach a troop of persons whose high rank was easily discerned by their gilded plumes and luxurious costumes, amongst whom was the general bearing the standard. Accompanied by some horsemen, Cortez threw himself upon this group and was fortunate enough, or skilful enough, to overturn by a lance thrust the Mexican general, who was then dispatched by the sword by a soldier named Juan de Salamanca. From the moment when the standard disappeared the battle was gained, and the Mexicans, panic-stricken, fled hastily from the field of battle. Never had the Spaniards incurred greater danger, says Prescott, and had it not been for the lucky star of Cortez, not one would have survived to transmit to posterity the history of the sanguinary battle of Otumba. The booty was considerable, and sufficed in part to indemnify the Spaniards for the loss they had sustained in leaving Mexico, for this army which they had just defeated was composed of the principal warriors of the nation, who, having been quite confident of success, had adorned themselves with their richest ornaments. The day after the battle the Spaniards entered the territory of Tlascala. Bernal Diaz says, "I shall now call the attention of curious readers to the fact that when we returned to Mexico to the relief of Alvarado, we were in all 1,300 men, including in that number 97 horsemen, 80 crossbowmen, and the same number armed with carbines. Besides, we had more than 2,000 Tlascalans, and much artillery." Our second entry into Mexico took place on St. John's Day, 1520. Our flight from the city was on the 10th day of the month of July following, and we fought the memorable battle of Otumba on the 14th day of this same month of July. And now I would draw attention to the number of men who were killed at Mexico during the passage of the causeways and bridges, in the battle of Otumba, and in the other encounters upon the route. I declare that in the space of 5 days 860 of our men were massacred, including 10 of our soldiers and 5 Castilian women, who were killed in the village of Rustepeque. We lost besides 1,200 Tlascalans during the same time. It is to be noticed also that if the number of dead in the troop of Narvaez were greater than in the troop of Cortez, it was because the former soldiers set out on the march laden with a quantity of gold, the weight of which hindered them from swimming and from getting out of the trenches. The troops with Cortez were reduced to 440 men, with 20 horses, 12 crossbowmen, and 7 carabiners. They had not a single charge of gunpowder. They were all wounded, lame, or maimed in the arms. It was the same number of men that had followed Cortez when he first entered Mexico, but how great a difference was there between that conquering troop and the vanquished soldiers who now quitted the capital. As they entered the Tlascalan territory, Cortez recommended his men, and especially those of Narvaez, not to do anything which could vex the natives, the common safety depending upon not irritating the only allies which remained to them. Happily the fears which had arisen as to the fidelity of the Tlascalans proved groundless. They gave the Spaniards a most sympathizing welcome, and their thoughts seemed to be wholly bent upon avenging the death of their brothers massacred by the Mexicans. While in their capital Cortès heard of the loss of 2 more detachments, but these reverses, grave as they were, did not discourage him. He had under his orders troops inured to war and faithful allies. Vera Cruz was intact, he might once more reckon upon his good fortune. But before undertaking a new campaign or entering upon another siege, help must be sought and preparations made, and with these objects in view the general set to work. He sent 4 ships to Hispaniola to enroll volunteers and purchase powder and ammunition, and meanwhile he caused trees to be cut down in the mountains of Tlascala, and with the wood thus obtained 12 brigantines were constructed, which were to be carried in pieces to the Lake of Mexico, to be launched there at the moment when needed. End of second part, Chapter 1, Part 2b. Recording by Jonathan Drury, Mexico City.